In February of 1939, a pope died, and for 11 days the oldest institution on earth had no leader. During those 11 days, according to a story that has never quite gone away, a sealed room deep beneath the Vatican was opened for the first time in generations. Not the famous archive that scholars whisper about. Something older than that. A vault that did not appear on the official floor plans, hidden behind a door that had been bricked over and plastered so smoothly that the wall looked continuous, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The men who opened it were not historians. They were not priests in the ordinary sense, and whatever they carried out of that room in wooden crates was never catalogued, never displayed, and never spoken of again in any document the public has ever been allowed to see. For most of a century, people who chase this story have asked the same question. What was worth hiding behind a false wall in the richest, oldest vault in the world? The answer, if the people who have followed this trail are right, is not gold. It is not a lost gospel or a forgotten saint. It is something stranger. They believe it is a record of a world that existed before ours. A civilization so completely erased that we walk through the bones of its cities every single day and call them something else entirely. This is the story of what they may have found, why 1939 was the year they finally went looking, and how a theory about buildings, ledgers, and a forgotten empire called Tartaria grew out of a single sealed door. Stay with it, because the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to unsee the thing this story is pointing at. To understand why anyone would believe there is a hidden vault beneath the Vatican, you first have to understand the vault that everyone agrees is real. Because the truth about the Vatican archive is already strange enough to make the rest feel possible. Underneath Vatican City, running for something close to 53 miles of shelving, sits one of the largest private collections of documents on the planet. For centuries it was called the Vatican Secret Archives. That name did most of the damage. In 2019, the Church quietly renamed it the Vatican Apostolic Archive, and officials were careful to explain that the old word secret never meant hidden in the sinister sense. It came from the Latin secretum, meaning private. The archive was the Pope's personal record, his private memory, not a public library. But here is the thing that keeps the story alive. For most of its existence, no outside scholar was allowed inside at all. The doors did not open to independent researchers until 1881, when Pope Leo XIII granted limited access. Even then, and even now, entire sections remain closed. You cannot simply walk in. You need credentials, a specific reason, and permission for specific documents. Whole categories of material stay sealed for reasons the Church does not always explain. Files touching certain modern popes, certain wars, certain political affairs stay locked away decade after decade. So already we have an institution that admits it holds miles of records, admits it keeps parts of them closed, and admits that for hundreds of years it let no outsider see anything. To the average person, that is just how a 2,000-year-old organization protects sensitive material. To the people who believe in the sealed vault, it is the perfect cover for something much larger. Because if you wanted to hide the true history of the world, you would not hide it in a warehouse. You would hide it inside the one archive that already has a legal, cultural, and religious reason to tell no one what it contains. The researchers who follow this trail make a simple point. We only know about the parts of the archive the Church has chosen to acknowledge. We have a map of the rooms they let us see. Nobody outside the highest levels of the Vatican has ever confirmed what the full structure looks like underground, how deep it goes, or what sits in the oldest sections that no catalogue has ever listed. And they ask a question that is hard to dismiss, out of hand. If a room existed down there that was never meant to be found, how exactly would we know? And they have real details to build that suspicion on. In the 1980s, the Vatican constructed a vast underground bunker beneath the courtyard of the archive, 2 subterranean floors of climate-controlled steel shelving, added because the collection had outgrown its old rooms. The believers seized on that word, bunker, and on the fact that the public was told almost nothing about what was moved down into it or how far below the surface it reaches. The archive holds documents that sound like they belong in fiction. The handwritten records of the trial of Galileo, correspondence touching Michelangelo, a letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, written while she awaited execution, the papal accounting of indulgences, requests for annulment from kings who wanted new wives. Some of the oldest parchments are so fragile they are kept in special conditions and shown to almost no one alive. There is material relating to the Church's dealings across the centuries with China, with the Islamic world, with civilizations Europe barely understood at the time it wrote them down. The point the believers press is not that any single one of these is sinister. It is that the archive is a place where the private memory of the most powerful continuous institution in human history has been concentrated for 2,000 years in rooms that outsiders have only ever glimpsed. If one door in that labyrinth was never listed, they ask, who alive would be in a position to notice its absence? Now move to the year itself, because the timing is the part of this story that even skeptics find uncomfortable. On the 10th of February, 1939, Pope Pius XI died. He had been in failing health, and his death set off the ancient machinery of the Church. The see was declared vacant. Cardinals began arriving in Rome from around the world. And for a short window, the Vatican entered the strange in-between state it calls the interregnum, the gap between one pope and the next, when authority scatters across a committee of cardinals and no single man holds the keys. On the 2nd of March, after one of the shortest conclaves in modern history, they elected Eugenio Pacelli, who took the name Pius XII. He would go on to lead the Church through the most catastrophic war in human history, and his conduct during that war is still argued about today. But the believers are not focused on the war. They are focused on those weeks before it, on the gap, on the 11 days when the throne sat empty. Their claim goes like this: a vacant see is the one moment when the normal rules bend. The Pope who guarded the deepest secrets is gone. His successor has not yet been sealed into the role. For a brief window, a small group of men with the right authority and the right keys could move through the lowest levels of the archive without a single superior to answer to. And the story says that is exactly what happened. That in the spring of 1939, with Europe weeks away from tearing itself apart, someone decided the old records needed to be secured before the world changed forever. Why 1939 specifically? The theory has an answer, and it is the part that connects everything else. Because 1939 was not just the eve of a war. According to the people who study what they call the reset, it was one of the last moments the old financial and physical order of the world was still intact enough to document. The gold was still moving. The old institutions still stood, and whatever knowledge survived from the world before was about to be buried under rubble, redrawn borders, and a brand new economic system that would be built from the ashes. If you wanted to lock away the true ledger of the old world, they say, you would do it in the last quiet moment before the fire. And 1939 was that moment. Where does this story even come from? Ask the people who repeat it, and the trail dissolves into fragments, which is either a warning sign or, depending on your temperament, exactly what you would expect from something built to stay hidden. There is no signed confession, no photograph of the crates, no named cardinal who broke his silence on a deathbed. What there is instead is a slowly assembled folklore, a line in an old memoir here, a second-hand account of a workman who claimed to have plastered over a doorway and was paid well to forget it, a researcher who says he was told, by someone who was told, that the lowest level of the archive holds a chamber no catalogue will admit. The story grew the way these stories always grow, passed from forum to video to book, each teller adding a detail and sanding down a doubt, until a rumour with no origin acquired the smooth confidence of established fact. Skeptics say that is the anatomy of a myth. Believers say that is the anatomy of a secret too dangerous to leave a paper trail. Both are describing the same process. The only difference is what you are already inclined to believe about the people who keep the doors closed. And that far more than any document is what this entire story turns on. To understand what the vault supposedly contained, you have to understand Tartaria. And to understand Tartaria, you have to look at an old map. Pull up almost any European map of the world, drawn between the 1500s and the early 1800s, and you will find a name stretched across a huge portion of the northern hemisphere: Tartary. Grand Tartary, Great Tartary. It covers land that today we split into Russia, Mongolia, Central Asia, parts of China, and sometimes reaches across the Pacific toward North America. On some of these maps, Tartary is not a vague blank space labelled by ignorant cartographers. It is drawn with cities, with a flag, with the confidence of a place that everyone at the time understood to exist. Then, over the course of a single century, the name vanishes. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria has been quietly erased from the maps and replaced with the borders we recognise now. Mainstream historians have an explanation for this, and we will come back to it, because it matters. But the believers see something else. They see the deliberate deletion of an empire. Not a loose region, not a European nickname for a foreign land, but a unified, advanced, global civilization that was systematically removed from the record so thoroughly that within a few generations, no one remembered it had ever ruled anything. Followers of the theory have a name for the whole process. They call it the reset, and they argue it has happened more than once, a recurring cycle in which a civilization rises to great heights, is wiped away by cataclysm, and is buried so thoroughly that the survivors mistake the ruins for the work of gods or ancients. Our reset, in their telling, is simply the most recent, and the only one recent enough to leave photographs behind. That is part of what makes the modern version so compelling to the people who believe it. It does not ask you to imagine a lost world through myth and a few weathered stones. It asks you to look at early photographs, at real cities captured by real cameras, and to see in those grainy images the last surviving portraits of a world in the final decades before it was rewritten. When they show you a photograph of a 19th century city, immaculate boulevards lined with palatial stone buildings, wide and clean and strangely underpopulated, they are not asking you to believe a fairy tale. They are asking you to distrust the caption underneath the picture. And distrusting a caption is a very small, very easy step to take. That is the genius of it and the trap of it. Every piece of evidence is something real that you can see with your own eyes. Only the story wrapped around it is invented. And this is where the theory stops being about maps and starts being about the buildings all around you. The core argument of the Tartaria movement is architectural. Its followers point to a specific kind of structure that appears all over the world, on every inhabited continent, in wildly different cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. Enormous stone buildings covered in ornate detail, domes and columns and hand-carved facades, cathedrals, capitol buildings, opera houses, train stations, and old banks that look less like functional structures and more like temples. They ask a question that sounds naive until you actually sit with it. How did isolated societies, many of them officially described as poor and technologically primitive, produce nearly identical masterworks of monumental architecture at the same time, in the same style, using techniques we supposedly cannot fully replicate today? Their answer is that they did not build them. The theory holds that these buildings are inheritance, leftovers, structures raised by an older, more advanced global civilization, and simply reoccupied by the people who came after, the way a family might move into a mansion they could never have constructed themselves. The story we are told, that each of these buildings was designed and raised from nothing by local hands in a few short years, is, in their view, the cover story stitched over the truth. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They have favourite examples, and the star forts sit at the top of the list. All over the world, from Europe to the Americas to Asia, you can find fortifications built in the shape of perfect geometric stars. Precise points radiating outward, often surrounded by moats, laid out with a mathematical symmetry that looks almost like a diagram of energy rather than a wall. Official history says these are artillery fortifications designed during the age of gunpowder so that defenders could cover every angle with crossfire and leave no blind spots for attackers. That explanation is clean and widely accepted. But the believers look at the sheer number of them, their global spread, their identical geometry across cultures that supposedly never spoke, and they see something other than military engineering. They see the surviving infrastructure of a single worldwide system, built by a single civilization for a purpose we have forgotten. And then there are the fairs. This is where the theory develops teeth, because it points at events that are extremely well documented and asks a genuinely uncomfortable question. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a series of enormous World's Fairs swept across the globe. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, known as the White City, is the most famous. Photographs show a breathtaking city of white palaces, grand domes, sweeping colonnades, statuary, lagoons, and boulevards stretching to the horizon. It was a complete metropolis of monumental classical architecture, and it appeared to have been constructed in only a few years, on schedule, to host a temporary event. Here is the part the theory seizes on. After the fair ended, almost all of it was demolished, torn down. We are told the entire White City was a temporary construction, built out of a plaster and fibre material meant to imitate stone, designed to be beautiful for a season and then destroyed. The believers refuse to accept this. They look at the scale, the craftsmanship, the impossibly short construction timelines, the sheer investment poured into structures that were supposedly meant to be thrown away within months, and they say it does not add up. Their alternative is jarring. They suggest these fairs were not built at all, that the fairs were staged inside cities that already existed, remnants of the old world, and that the demolition afterward was not the tearing down of temporary plaster. It was the removal of evidence, the dismantling of real, ancient structures so that the official timeline could hold. In their telling, the World's Fairs were a global operation to reintroduce the surviving architecture of the old world to the public under a harmless cover story, photograph it, and then erase it before too many people asked how it got there. And Chicago was only one of them. The believers walk you through a whole sequence. Paris in 1889, which raised the Eiffel Tower, and an enormous iron and glass gallery of machines that was later demolished. Paris, again, in 1900, a city within a city of ornate palaces strung along the Seine, most of them torn down when the exposition closed. San Francisco in 1915, the Panama Pacific Exposition, a shimmering domed metropolis built, we are told, on landfill in a couple of years and then almost entirely erased, leaving only a single restored palace standing today, as if to prove the rest had ever existed. Buffalo, St. Louis, and London's Crystal Palace of glass and iron, which stood for decades and then conveniently burned to the ground. To the ordinary eye, this is the history of a golden age of expositions, when proud nations competed to outdazzle one another. To the believers, it is a pattern too consistent to be innocent. Build something impossibly grand, in an impossibly short time, photograph it for the whole world, and then remove it before anyone can study it too closely. They add a stranger observation on top. Look at the old photographs, they say, and notice the hills scraped bare, the absence of large mature trees, the raw new earth around these supposedly ancient structures, as if the landscape itself had been recently reset and was only beginning to grow back. It sounds impossible. But then they show you the photographs, the timelines, the demolitions, and for a moment the impossible thing has just enough shape to make you uneasy. And once you are uneasy, the theory takes you to the ground beneath your feet. The next pillar of the story is the one that gave the movement its strangest and most memorable name, the mud flood. Walk through the old district of almost any major city and you may notice something you have never consciously registered. Buildings whose ground floor windows sit at or below the level of the sidewalk, doorways that seem to descend into the earth, ornate first floors that are half swallowed, with the real entrance now one story up, basements with fully finished windows, arches and details that make no sense for a room that was always meant to be underground. Standard explanation, and it is a real one, is that cities raise their street grades over time. They pave over old roads, build up levels for drainage and sewers and utilities, and over a century or two the ground rises while the old buildings stay put. It is a documented, ordinary process. The Tartaria theory rejects that as insufficient. It proposes instead a catastrophe, a global event, sometime in the not-too-distant past, in which a wave of mud and sediment swept across the world and buried the lower levels of the old world cities in a single, sudden layer, a mud flood. In this telling, The buried ground floors are not the result of slow municipal paving. They are the drowned foundations of a civilization that was wiped out almost overnight, its cities choked with earth, its survivors left to dig out the upper floors and start again with no memory of what had happened. And that raises the darkest question in the entire theory. If a whole civilization was buried, where did the people go? The believers have an answer for that too, and it is the part that turns the story from architecture into something that grips people by the throat. They point to the orphans. In the United States, between the 1850s and the 1920s, there was a real program known as the orphan trains. Tens of thousands of children, described as orphaned or abandoned, were gathered from eastern cities and shipped west by rail to be placed with new families. It is a documented chapter of American history, usually framed as a well-meaning if flawed response to urban poverty. The theory reframes it completely. It asks why there were suddenly so many orphaned children. It asks why the same era shows records of institutions overflowing with the parentless, why old census numbers seem strange to the believers, why so many photographs of that period show grand cities that feel curiously empty of people relative to the scale of the buildings around them. And it offers a chilling reinterpretation. The orphans, they say, were the survivors of the reset, a generation of children left behind after the old population was wiped away, gathered up and redistributed into a new society that would grow up with no memory of the world their parents came from. Raise a generation of children with no past, the theory says, and within a lifetime the old world simply ceases to exist in living memory. There is no one left who remembers. The erasure completes itself. This is the machinery of the reset, a catastrophe that buries the cities, a lost generation with no memory, a new timeline written over the old one, and a set of institutions, the map makers, the historians, the record keepers, working to make sure the cover story holds. It is a grand, dark, and deeply human fear dressed in the clothing of history. The fear that the world you were handed is not the real one, that someone, somewhere, knows the truth and has decided you should not. There is one more piece the believers add before the money, and it is the fires. The late 1800s were an age of enormous urban infernos. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which leveled the heart of the city. The fire that consumed most of Seattle in 1889, the blazes that followed the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 and did more damage than the shaking itself. City after city, in the same few decades, reduced to ash and then rebuilt. Official history treats these as tragic accidents of the era, the natural fate of dense cities built largely of wood and lit by open flame. The theory treats them as too frequent and too convenient to be coincidence. In this reading, the fires were not accidents at all. They were the final tool of the reset, a way to clear away the last standing remnants of the old world's architecture in places where mud and time had not finished the job, and to justify rebuilding those cities in the new official style, on the new official timeline. Burn the evidence, blame a cow or a lantern or an earthquake, and rebuild the record along with the streets. Whether you find that chilling or absurd depends entirely on how much you already trust the story of how your own city came to look the way it does. And this is exactly where the money comes in. Because the version of this theory that leads back to the Vatican vault is not really about architecture, it is about economics, it is about who controls the ledger. The revisionist economic history at the heart of this story makes a bold claim. It says the old world did not run on the system we run on now. No central banks issuing debt, no fiat currency conjured from nothing and loaned into existence with interest attached, no global financial order in which nations are permanently indebted to institutions that produce nothing. Instead, the theory imagines an older economy built on real wealth, on abundance, on a technology of energy so cheap and so widely available that scarcity itself was close to abolished. That technology, in this telling, was free energy. The believers point to the towers. All across the old cities stood ornate structures topped with domes, spires, antennas, and copper crowns, structures we now call decorative or religious or civic. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The theory says they were functional. It says the old world drew power directly from the atmosphere, from the electrical charge in the air and the earth, a wireless system that lit and heated and powered entire cities without a wire running to a meter, without a bill, without a company standing between a human being and the energy they needed to live. The name they return to again and again is Nikola Tesla. Tesla, who really did dream of transmitting power wirelessly. Tesla, who really did build a great tower at Wardenclyffe on Long Island, intending to send energy through the earth itself to anyone with a receiver. Tesla, whose tower was really torn down, whose funding really did collapse, and whose papers were really seized by the United States government after his death in that very same period, the early 1940s. The believers do not see a failed inventor whose ideas were ahead of the engineering. They see the last flicker of the old world's suppressed technology, a man rediscovering what had already been done a century before, and being shut down for exactly that reason. They go further, and this is where the theory circles back to architecture. Look up, they say, at the tops of the grand old buildings, the copper domes gone green with age, the ornate metal spires, the rods and finials and crown-like structures that we now dismiss as decoration or as lightning protection. The believers see receivers and resonators, the visible hardware of a wireless power grid hidden in plain sight, mistaken by later generations for ornament because the people who inherited the buildings had no idea what the crowns were actually for. The red brick and the sandstone that so many of these old structures share is not an accident of fashion, they argue, but a property of the system, materials chosen for how they interact with electrical energy. Even the endless rows of iron fencing around old parks and mansions get folded in, reimagined as antennas and conductors rather than boundaries. Once you accept the premise, everything ordinary starts to look like a component. That is the seductive momentum of the whole theory. It hands you a new pair of eyes, and through them, the entire built world stops being a collection of separate accidents and becomes a single machine with a single hidden purpose. It is a genuinely thrilling way to see a city. It is also, almost certainly, a way of seeing faces in wallpaper. Because here is the logic that ties the money to the mystery. If energy is free, if abundance is the natural state of the world, then you cannot build an empire on debt. You cannot loan a nation into servitude if that nation does not need you for the one thing everything else depends on. A civilization with free energy is a civilization that cannot be owned. And so, the theory argues, the reset was not only a catastrophe, it was an opportunity. The old world's technology was buried, its people scattered, its memory erased, and in the vacuum a new order was constructed, an order built deliberately on scarcity, on the meter, the bill, the loan, the interest, on the idea, drilled into every generation since, that there is never quite enough and that you must borrow to survive. And whoever ran that transition, the believers say, needed to do one thing above all. They needed to control the ledger. They needed to secure the records of the old world so completely that no one could ever prove the new scarcity was a choice rather than a law of nature. The maps that showed the true extent of Tartaria, the financial records of an economy that ran on abundance, the blueprints of the energy system that made it possible, the census that showed who had really lived and died. Gather all of it, seal it away, and the reset becomes permanent. The old world does not just die, it becomes unprovable. And the believers anchor this to real dates, which is what gives the economic version of the theory its grip. They point to 1913, the year the United States created its Federal Reserve, handing the power to issue the nation's money to a system built around private banks, and the same year the modern federal income tax arrived. Two pillars of the scarcity system, they say, quietly set in place within months of each other. They point to 1933, when Americans were ordered to surrender their private gold, and the dollars linked to it was bent out of shape. They point to 1944, to a resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, where the nations that were about to win the war gathered to design the financial order that would follow it. creating the institutions that would manage global money for the rest of the century. And they draw a single line through all of it. A world that once ran on abundance, they argue, was converted step by deliberate step into a world that runs on debt, and the conversion was locked in across exactly the span of years that surrounds our sealed door in 1939. First, you erase the memory of the old economy. Then you seal away the proof. Then you build the new system in the open, in plain sight, and dare anyone to claim it was ever any different. The theory even reaches back to an ancient idea to name what was taken. The Jubilee, the old practice of periodically cancelling all debts and returning the world to a clean slate, a reset in the merciful sense. The old world, they say, knew how to forgive debt. The new one was built so that debt could never be forgiven again, only grown. Which brings us back to the sealed door, and to 1939. The story the believers tell about that spring is specific, and it is built to make everything before it click into place. They say that the consolidation of the old world's records was a project that spanned centuries, but that it had a deadline. The coming war would redraw the map of the world and reset the global financial system from the ground up. Within a decade of 1939, the old order of gold-backed national currencies would give way to a new architecture of central coordination, international lending institutions, and reserve currencies managed from a handful of rooms. The believers connect this to the real conferences that reshaped global finance in the 1940s, the meetings that created the institutions that still govern money today. A new economic world was about to be born, and you cannot build a new world cleanly on top of an old one whose records are scattered and exposed. So, the story goes, in the vacant weeks after the death of Pius XI, a decision was made to secure the last of it, to bring the most dangerous documents down into the deepest level of the archive, into a room that had been prepared long before, and seal them behind a wall built to look like it had always been there. The crates that went in, they say, held the true history. The maps of the empire that was erased, the ledgers of the economy that ran on abundance, the technical records of a power that would have made the coming century of scarcity impossible. And the men who did it were not there to study any of it. They were there to bury it one final time, in the one place on earth with the authority, the secrecy, and the permanence to keep it buried for good. No inventory was ever released. No scholar was ever admitted to that level, and the timing, the believers insist, is not a coincidence anyone should be comfortable with. The old world's memory was sealed away in the exact season the modern world was being born. That is the story in its complete form, and it is powerful. It explains the buildings you cannot unnotice once you have seen them. It explains the buried floors, the demolished fairs, the vanished empire, the sudden orphans, the suppressed inventor, and the debt you were born into. It gives a single, elegant answer to 100 loose threads, which is exactly the moment a careful person should slow down and ask the hardest question of all. Not is this exciting, but is any of it true? Because a good story that explains everything is the most seductive and the most dangerous thing a mind can encounter. So let us do the thing these videos almost never do. Let us take the theory apart, piece by piece, and see honestly what survives. Start with Tartaria itself. The maps are real. The word Tartary genuinely appears across centuries of European cartography, stretched over enormous stretches of Asia. But historians who actually study those maps explain what the word meant, and the explanation is not a cover-up. Tartary was a European catch-all term. It was the name Western mapmakers gave to the vast, poorly understood interior of Asia, the lands of the peoples they lumped together as Tartars, a loose and often inaccurate label for Mongol, Turkic, and other Central Asian groups. It was never the name of a single, unified empire with one government and one flag. It was closer to the way old European maps wrote terra incognita over places they did not know. As European knowledge of Asia grew, as Russia expanded eastward and the region was mapped in detail, the vague old label was simply replaced by the specific names of the peoples and states that were actually there. The name did not vanish because an empire was erased. It faded because ignorance was replaced by knowledge. That is the ordinary, well-documented history, and it accounts for the maps completely without a single hidden vault. Now the architecture. The claim that isolated primitive societies could not have built the great monumental structures of the world rests on a quiet insult that does not hold up. Human beings have been raising astonishing monumental architecture for thousands of years, from the pyramids to the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, cathedrals that took a century or more to complete and were built by societies with far less technology than the 19th century possessed. By the 1800s, the era most of these disputed buildings come from, humanity had steel, industrial manufacturing, railroads to move stone, growing cities full of skilled masons, and a revival movement in architecture that deliberately imitated classical and Gothic styles. The reason Capitol buildings and opera houses and old banks around the world look similar is not that a lost empire built them all. It is that architects were consciously copying the same admired classical models, trained in the same schools, working from the same pattern books in the same few decades. The similarity is a documented fashion, not a mystery. The star forts have an even cleaner explanation, and it is not hidden. The star shape is a direct, logical response to the invention of the cannon. When gunpowder made tall vertical castle walls obsolete, engineers designed low, angled, star-shaped fortifications specifically so that every section of wall could be covered by defensive fire from adjacent points, eliminating the blind corners where attackers used to shelter. The geometry that looks mystical is pure ballistics. The reason they appear worldwide is that European military engineering spread worldwide through empire and trade during the exact period these forts were built. There are engineering manuals from the 16 and 1700s that lay out the mathematics of their design in detail. Nothing about them requires a forgotten civilization. The World's Fairs are documented down to the invoices. The White City of 1893 really was built quickly, but not mysteriously. It was constructed largely from a material called staff, a temporary mix of plaster and fibre over wooden and steel frames, precisely because it was meant to be temporary and grand rather than permanent and structural. We have the architects' names, the construction photographs showing the frames going up, the budgets, the labour records, and the accounts of the fire and demolition that followed. The fairs were extraordinary achievements of 19th century engineering and showmanship, which is remarkable enough. They were not the ruins of an older world. The buried ground floors, the heart of the mudflood claim, come from a mix of ordinary causes that are all well understood. Cities genuinely do raise their street levels over time for drainage, sewage, and regrading. Buildings settle. Ground floors that were always intended as basements or service levels get misread by modern eyes. In specific cities, there are specific, documented reasons for raised streets, and none of them require a global wall of mud that somehow left the upper floors of millions of buildings perfectly intact while burying only the bottoms. A flood that could bury the ground floors of cities worldwide would leave a colossal, unmistakable geological signature, and that signature does not exist in the sediment record. The orphan trains were real, and their real story is sad enough without a reset. 19th century cities were overwhelmed by immigration, disease, and brutal poverty. Epidemics really did leave children parentless. Families really were shattered by cholera, tuberculosis, industrial accidents, and destitution. The orphan trains were a documented, well-studied, and ethically complicated social program run by real, charitable organizations whose records survive. The children were not the survivors of a buried civilization. They were the victims of ordinary, terrible 19th century urban conditions, and we know their names, their origins, and where they went. Even the free energy claim, the emotional core of the whole thing, does not survive contact with physics. There is no atmospheric energy source that can be tapped to power a city for free. Tesla was a genuine genius, and his story is genuinely tragic. But the reason wireless power transmission at that scale failed is that the physics does not work. Energy spreads out and dissipates as it travels through the air and the earth, and the losses are enormous. His papers were reviewed after his death and found to contain speculation and unfinished ideas, not a suppressed blueprint for infinite power. The world runs on scarcity of energy, not because someone hid the abundance, but because concentrating and delivering usable energy is genuinely hard and genuinely costs something. The fires have causes that are painfully well understood. 19th century cities were tinderboxes. They were packed with wooden buildings, warmed by open stoves, lit by candles and oil lamps, and later by gas, and served by fire departments with hand pumps and horse-drawn engines that could not hope to contain a blaze once it took hold. Enormous urban fires were not a sinister anomaly. They were the predictable result of building dense, flammable cities before modern fire codes and firefighting existed, which is precisely why those codes and those departments were created in response to them. The expositions, likewise, are documented achievements rather than mysteries. They were temporary by design, built fast and grand and cheap to be spectacular for a single season, and torn down afterward because keeping acres of decorative plaster palaces standing forever was never the point. The reason they used so much iron and glass is that the 19th century had just learned to mass-produce both. The same reason the era gave us iron bridges, glass conservatories, and great railway sheds. As for the economic dates, they are real, but the story bends them. The Federal Reserve, the income tax, the end of the gold standard, and the Bretton Woods institutions were real and consequential decisions about money and power, argued over fiercely at the time and ever since. You do not need a buried civilization to find them worth scrutinizing. You only need to read the ordinary, contested, thoroughly documented history of how modern finance was assembled by people pursuing ordinary motives of stability, control, and self-interest. The injustice the theory points at can be real. The buried empire it blames for that injustice is not required to explain it. And the vault. The sealed room beneath the Vatican opened in 1939. Here is the honest position: there is no evidence it exists. No document, no photograph, no credible witness, no leaked inventory. The Vatican archive is real, its restricted sections are real, and the death and succession of 1939 are real historical events. But the sealed vault, full of the erased history of the world, is a claim with nothing behind it except the shape of a good story. It cannot be proven, and its defenders will tell you that the absence of proof is itself the proof that of course there is no record, because hiding the record was the entire point. This is the trapdoor at the center of every conspiracy of this kind. It is built so that nothing can ever disprove it. And a claim that no possible evidence could ever refute is not a hidden truth. It is a belief wearing the costume of history. So why does it endure? Why, when every individual pillar has an ordinary explanation, does the theory keep pulling people in, growing, spreading, feeling truer than the dry facts that dismantle it? That question is more interesting than the theory itself, because the answer says something real about the world we actually live in. The story survives because it is pointing at feelings that are legitimate, even when the explanation it offers is not. Look at the emotional engine underneath it. It says the modern world is uglier than the one before. Anyone who has stood inside a 100-year-old train station and then walked into a modern airport terminal has felt a version of that. It says ordinary people were robbed of an inheritance and handed a system of permanent debt they never agreed to. Anyone who has watched the cost of a home or an education climb out of reach has felt that too. It says the powerful institutions that shape our lives do not tell us the whole truth. History gives us more than enough reasons to distrust that anyone in power is being fully honest. The theory takes these real, grounded, widely shared feelings, the sense of lost beauty, of economic injustice, of institutional secrecy, and it braids them into a single story with villains and a hidden vault and a lost golden age. It gives shapeless anxiety a shape, and a shaped fear is easier to hold than a formless one. That is the real function of the sealed door. It is not really a claim about a room under the Vatican. It is a container for the suspicion that the world we were handed is a diminished copy of one that should have been ours. And that suspicion does not go away when you explain the star forts, because it was never really about the star forts. And history really has erased things, which is the uncomfortable ground the theory grows in, and the reason it cannot simply be laughed off. The Great Library of Alexandria really did burn, and we will never know the full scale of what was lost inside it. Conquerors really have torched the records of the peoples they defeated, precisely so those peoples would forget who they had been. Regimes across the centuries have rewritten textbooks, airbrushed inconvenient figures out of photographs, renamed cities, and buried the crimes of the powerful under official silence. Whole languages have gone extinct with no dictionary left behind. Whole peoples have been reduced to a handful of artifacts in a museum case, their names supplied by the very empires that destroyed them. The deliberate erasure of the past is not a paranoid fantasy. It is one of the most reliable habits of power, documented in every century we have records for. So when the theory whispers that someone might have erased a civilization and sealed the proof away, it is not inventing a brand new fear out of nothing. It is borrowing the emotional weight of 1,000 real erasures and aiming it at an imaginary one. That is why the ordinary rebuttals never quite land for a committed believer. You can take apart the star forts and the mud flood and the towers one by one, and the feeling underneath survives every argument, because the feeling was true all along. Things really do get buried. History really is written by the survivors. The theory's mistake is not in sensing that. Its mistake is in deciding it already knows exactly what was buried and exactly who buried it, and refusing to consider that the honest answer might be smaller, sadder, and far less satisfying than a lost golden age sleeping beneath our feet. The danger, and it is worth naming plainly, is that a story built to be unfalsifiable trains the people who believe it to distrust every source that could correct them. Once the mapmakers, the historians, the physicists and the archivists are all cast as part of the cover-up, there is no longer any authority left that a believer will accept. Every debunking becomes further proof of the conspiracy. The mind closes into a loop it cannot climb out of, because the loop is designed to have no exit. That is what makes this kind of theory more than a harmless curiosity. Not the belief in a lost empire, but the slow training of a person to reject the very tools they would need to ever find their way back to solid ground. And yet, stand in the story one more time. At the door, in the spring of 1939, a pope is dead. Europe is holding its breath, and somewhere, real or imagined, there is a wall built to look like it was never built, with something on the other side that someone decided the world was better off never seeing. The honest truth is that we do not need a buried empire to explain the buildings, or a mud flood to explain the streets, or a hidden vault to explain the world we live in. The ordinary history is strange enough. Real institutions really do keep real secrets. Powerful people really do shape the record. Beautiful things really are lost. And the modern world really was built, deliberately, on choices about money and power that were made in rooms most of us will never enter, in years like 1939, while the rest of the world was looking somewhere else. Maybe that is the thing the sealed door is really guarding. Not a lost civilization, but a simpler and harder idea. That history is written by the people who survived to write it, that the winners choose what we remember, and that the past is always, in the end, a story we agree to tell. The vault does not have to be real for that to be true, and perhaps that is the most unsettling thought this whole strange story leaves behind. You went looking for a hidden room full of forbidden maps. What you found instead was a mirror, and the quiet realization that the questions the theory asks are far more powerful than the answers it gives. So how do you hold a story like this without letting it hold you? The answer is not to stop being curious. Curiosity is not the problem. The problem is the moment curiosity hardens into certainty, the moment the questions stop being doors and become walls. It is a healthy thing to stand inside an old building and wonder why we do not build like that anymore. It is a healthy thing to look at the debt you were born into and ask who designed it and why. It is even healthy to distrust the official version of events, because the official version has been wrong, and worse than wrong, more times than any honest history can count. What is not healthy is the leap from good questions to a sealed answer that no fact can ever touch. The skill worth practicing is the ability to sit inside a mystery, to feel its pull, to take its questions seriously, and still to say the three hardest words in any real investigation: I don't know. The believers and the debunkers both offer you the comfort of certainty. The harder and more honest path runs between them, where the questions stay open, the evidence gets weighed on its own merits, and no single story is ever allowed to explain everything. Because a story that explains everything has usually stopped being history and started becoming faith. The door in the story stays sealed. It always will. Because the moment it opened and revealed nothing, the story would end, and the mystery that has kept us watching all this time would quietly die with it too. And some part of us, the part that suspects the world could have been more than this, does not want it to end at all.